The first thing people noticed on the morning I locked my workshop for what I believed would be the last season of my life was not the empty shelves or the faded sign hanging above the door. It was the bench. 3 different buyers offered more money for it before noon, and I turned every one of them away without even asking their names. By sunset, the entire town had decided I had finally become an old fool. They could understand closing a business after 50 years. They could not understand why I refused to sell the finest piece I had ever built. What none of them knew was that the bench had never belonged to me in the first place. If you have ever watched a quiet promise outlive the person who made it, stay with me for a little while. My name rarely appeared anywhere beyond a receipt or a handwritten invoice. Around Maple Hollow, people simply called me Mr. Whitaker, the carpenter who could repair almost anything made of wood. For more than 5 decades, my little workshop had smelled of cedar, walnut, linseed oil, and fresh shavings curling across the floor like tiny ribbons. Children who once peeked through my doorway had grown into grandparents, bringing their own families back to order rocking chairs, dining tables, and porch swings. Time, however, shapes craftsmen just as surely as craftsmen shape timber. At 78, my hands still remembered every tool, but they no longer obeyed them without complaint. My shoulders stiffened before sunrise, and my eyesight faded a little more with each winter. I had finally accepted what every honest tradesman must accept sooner or later. It was time to close the shop with dignity instead of waiting until age made the decision for me. My apprentice, Ethan Brooks, refused to treat the announcement like the end of anything. "You could teach for another 10 years, he said, while stacking lumber beside the planer. I smiled without looking up. Teaching only matters if someone is ready to learn what can't be written in a manual. He laughed softly, believing I was talking about woodworking. Someday he would understand I meant something much larger. Near the entrance stood the bench everyone admired. Solid white oak, hand-cut joinery, a gently curved backrest polished until the grain shimmered beneath the afternoon light. I had built hundreds of pieces over my lifetime, yet none of them carried the quiet weight this one did. Every morning I dusted it before opening the front door. Every evening I rested one hand against its smooth arm before switching off the lights. Customers often joked that I loved the bench more than my own furniture. Perhaps that was the easiest story for them to believe. Just before closing time, a retired judge stopped outside, examined the bench, and offered nearly double what it was worth. When I declined, he frowned in disbelief. "Everyone has a price, Samuel." I met his eyes calmly. "No, sir. Some things have a purpose." He waited for an explanation that never came. After he drove away, Ethan looked at me with the same question everyone else carried, but was too polite to ask. Later that evening, while organizing boxes that had not been opened in decades, he called my name from the storage room. His voice was steady, but something inside it had changed. "Mr. Whitaker, I think I just found something you're going to want to see." The storage room had always been the quietest corner of my workshop. Shelves bowed beneath decades of carefully labeled boxes. Old hand planes rested beside coffee cans filled with brass screws, and the faint scent of cedar lingered where sunlight rarely reached. Ethan stood beside a work table, holding a worn leather portfolio with both hands, as though he had stumbled across something fragile enough to disappear if he breathed too hard. "I wasn't looking through your personal things," he said quickly. "The latch on this cabinet broke while I was moving it." "I know," I answered. "Open it. Inside rested yellowed design sketches folded around several envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a black and white photograph of two young men standing outside this very workshop, smiling beside stacks of freshly milled oak. I recognized myself immediately. The other man looked just as familiar, though the years between then and now made the memory ache before it arrived. Ethan studied the photograph. "Who's the other Carpenter?" "My older brother," I replied after a long silence. "Thomas." He nodded, waiting patiently. One thing I admired about Ethan was that he never rushed another person's memories. He understood that old stories often arrived in their own time. The first letter had been opened so many times that its folds had nearly separated. Ethan handed it to me without reading a word. My fingers traced the handwriting before I unfolded the page. Thomas had written it more than 50 years earlier, only weeks before leaving home to volunteer with a disaster relief construction team rebuilding communities, devastated by a powerful hurricane along the Gulf Coast. We had planned to open the workshop together after he returned. Instead, the rebuilding mission stretched from months into years. Then the letters slowly stopped. People assumed he had settled somewhere else, married, or simply chosen another life. Officials searched when communication disappeared, but no clear answer ever came home with them. My mother refused to believe he was gone until the day she passed away. My father never spoke of him again. Ethan looked toward the bench near the front windows. "So, that bench. It was supposed to be our first commission together after he came home." The words felt strangely lighter once they were spoken aloud. "We chose the oak ourselves. Thomas designed the curved backrest. I insisted on the wider armrests because he always said people stayed longer when a bench welcomed conversation." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's exactly what people do whenever they sit there. They do." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan uncovered another envelope tucked beneath the sketches. Unlike the others, it had never been opened. Across the front, in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, were only 7 words. "For the day we finish what we started." Neither of us knew why the letter had remained sealed for half a century. Neither of us could explain why my father had hidden it among workshop records instead of placing it with the family photographs. Until that moment, I had believed the bench existed only because I could never bear to sell the last thing my brother had imagined beside me. Now another possibility quietly entered the room. Maybe I had misunderstood the promise all these years. Ethan looked back toward the storefront, where evening sunlight rested across the polished seat. "If that letter changes everything, it might," I admitted. "And if it does?" I carefully slipped the unopened envelope into my shirt pocket. "Then closing this workshop isn't the end of my work." For the first time since announcing my retirement, I realized the future might be asking more of us than preserving an old piece of furniture. It might be asking us to discover where a forgotten promise had been waiting all along. I carried the unopened letter home that evening, but I could not bring myself to break the seal. For 50 years, I had believed the greatest act of loyalty was preserving my brother's memory exactly as it had been left behind. Opening those words felt strangely close to disturbing something sacred. Instead, I placed the envelope beside the old brass compass Thomas had carried since childhood, the same compass that had rested on my workbench every day since he disappeared. It had become less of a tool than a quiet reminder that some journeys never truly end. The following morning, Ethan arrived before sunrise. I couldn't stop thinking about that letter, he admitted. Neither could I. He hesitated before speaking again. What if your father hid it because he wanted you to find it only after you were ready? I considered the thought while unlocking the front door. My father believed promises mattered more than explanations. Ethan nodded slowly, though I could tell he was trying to solve a mystery with logic instead of patience. Business continued as usual. Neighbors stopped by to wish me well. Several customers collected furniture that had been finished weeks earlier, and another collector offered an amount of money that would have covered nearly 2 years of retirement expenses if I sold the bench. I thanked him sincerely before declining once again. After he left, Ethan finally asked the question everyone else avoided. If the letter says Thomas wanted the bench sold someday, would you do it? I surprised both of us with my answer. Yes. His eyebrows lifted. I thought you said you'd never sell it. I said I wouldn't sell it for my reasons. If Thomas left different instructions, then my reasons stopped mattering. For the first time, Ethan understood that the bench had never been protected because of stubbornness. It had been protected because I believed I was serving someone else's unfinished wish. Late that afternoon, we carefully opened the envelope together. Inside was not a farewell. It was only a single handwritten page. Samuel. If life pulls me farther away than either of us expects, don't make the mistake of keeping this bench because of me. Finish what we started. Find the family waiting for it. They'll know why. No names, no address. Only those 12 words. Silence settled across the workshop. Ethan read the note twice before looking at me. Family? I don't know which family. You never asked your parents? They never mentioned anyone. For several minutes, we searched through every sketch inside the portfolio, hoping another clue might appear. Most pages contained measurements, wood selections, and construction notes. Then Ethan paused over one drawing of the bench viewed from above. There. He pointed toward a tiny carving marked beneath the right armrest. I leaned closer. Hidden among the decorative vine pattern was a barely visible symbol, a small lighthouse enclosed inside a circle. I had carved it myself, yet I had completely forgotten doing it. Does it mean anything? Ethan asked. At first I shook my head. Then a memory returned without warning. Years ago, Thomas had insisted on driving 3 hours to a quiet coastal town because he wanted me to meet someone who volunteered at an old lighthouse museum. We had spent only one afternoon there before he left for the hurricane rebuilding project. I could no longer remember the woman's face. I could barely remember her name. But I remembered one thing with absolute certainty. She had smiled when Thomas told her, "One day we'll bring the bench." Until now, I had believed that sentence belonged to an ordinary conversation between young dreamers. Now it sounded like a destination. Ethan folded the sketch carefully. So, our first assumption was wrong. It usually is, I answered softly. The bench was never waiting for Thomas. I looked through the front window at the empty seat glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. It has been waiting for someone else all along. For the next week, the workshop remained open, but very little woodworking happened inside it. Instead, Ethan and I spread decades of notebooks, invoices, sketches, and fading photographs across every available table, searching for a family whose identity had somehow disappeared from memory without disappearing from my brother's heart. The more carefully we searched, the stranger the pattern became. Thomas had documented every project with remarkable precision, yet the bench that now stood near the front window appeared only in scattered references. Measurements were complete. Wood selections were detailed. Even the finishing oil was recorded. But wherever a customer's name should have appeared, the page had been left intentionally blank. "That couldn't have been an accident," Ethan observed. "No," I answered. "Thomas never forgot a client's name." The omission transformed the mystery. We were no longer trying to remember someone we had forgotten. We were trying to understand why my brother had wanted the identity hidden from everyone except the person who would eventually need to find it. 3 days later, another clue emerged from an unlikely place. An elderly woman named Margaret Dawson visited the workshop, carrying a small rocking chair I had repaired nearly 20 years earlier. She wanted one loose spindle tightened before I retired for good. As I worked, her eyes wandered toward the bench. "I always wondered why you never sold that one," she said. I smiled politely. "So did everyone else." She chuckled, then grew unexpectedly thoughtful. "You know, I think I saw your brother sketching that design once." The chisel stopped in my hand. "You knew Thomas?" "Only briefly." She closed her eyes, searching through memories. "It wasn't here. It was at the Harbor Point Lighthouse Festival. You boys were helping rebuild several picnic tables after a coastal storm." Harbor Point. The name struck me like an echo returning from decades away. Until that moment, I had remembered only fragments. The lighthouse, the ocean wind, Thomas introducing me to someone whose face I could no longer picture. Margaret's words restored another piece. "There was a young woman with a little girl," she continued quietly. "Your brother spent nearly the entire afternoon talking with them." Ethan looked toward me. "Does that sound familiar?" "Only barely." Margaret frowned. "I remember something else because I thought it was unusual. Before leaving, your brother placed his hand on the unfinished drawing and told the child, 'When this bench is ready, you'll always have somewhere to come home to.'" The sentence settled over the room like dust floating through afternoon sunlight. A child. Not simply a customer, not merely a family. Someone Thomas believed would one day need a place to return. After Margaret left, Ethan unfolded the original sketch once more. "Maybe we've been asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "We keep asking who the bench belonged to." He pointed toward the lighthouse carving beneath the armrest. "But maybe the bench wasn't meant for ownership." I looked at him carefully. "Go on." "What if it was meant to wait?" The words reached somewhere deep inside me. Suddenly, dozens of small details that had never seemed important began fitting together. The unusually durable white oak, the weather-resistant finish Thomas insisted upon, the wider seating area designed for more than one person, even the location where I had displayed it, always facing outward toward the street instead of inward toward the showroom. The bench had never been treated like merchandise because, without realizing it, I had always treated it like it was waiting for someone to arrive. That realization changed everything. It also created a deadline we could no longer ignore. In less than 3 weeks, the property would officially transfer to its new owner. Once the workshop closed, the bench would have nowhere left to wait. For the first time in 50 years, preserving my brother's promise no longer meant protecting the bench. It meant finding the people who had unknowingly been searching for the end of the same story. I folded Thomas's letter and slipped it carefully back into my pocket. "We're going to Harbor Point." Ethan smiled. And if no one remembers them? I looked once more at the lighthouse carved beneath the armrest. Then we'll have to trust that Thomas left one more clue we haven't learned how to see yet. 2 mornings later, Ethan and I loaded the oak bench into my aging pickup truck before dawn. For years, I had believed moving it would somehow betray my brother. Now, every mile toward Harbor Point felt less like carrying furniture and more like honoring the purpose he had trusted me to finish. Even so, an uneasy question stayed with me throughout the drive. What if we had arrived 50 years too late? The lighthouse still overlooked the Atlantic exactly as I remembered, though the paint had faded and newer buildings surrounded the harbor. Tourists wandered along the waterfront, while fishermen unloaded their morning catch. Everything had changed, yet the ocean carried the same steady rhythm that Thomas had loved. Our first stop was the small historical museum beside the lighthouse. An elderly volunteer greeted us warmly, introducing herself as Helen Mercer. When I explained that my brother had volunteered here decades earlier, her thoughtful smile slowly disappeared. "Thomas Whitaker," she whispered. "I haven't heard that name in a very long time." My heartbeat quickened. "You remember him?" "I remember his kindness." She invited us into a quiet archive room lined with photographs of storms, rebuilding projects, and community volunteers. After several minutes of searching through carefully labeled albums, she removed one worn photograph. There we were. Thomas stood beside the unfinished bench frame. Next to him smiled a young woman holding the hand of a little girl no older than 6. My chest tightened. I knew there was a child. Helen nodded. Her name was Emily. And her mother? Sarah Collins. The names felt strangely familiar, yet distant enough that I could not place them. Helen looked toward the photograph again. Sarah lost her husband during the hurricane. Thomas spent weeks helping rebuild her home after the relief crews moved on. Ethan remained silent, sensing there was more. Helen sighed gently. Your brother admired her deeply, but that wasn't why he kept returning. She pointed toward the little girl. Emily stopped speaking after the storm. I looked back at the photograph. The child held tightly to Thomas's hand. He built small wooden toys for her, Helen continued. Birds, boats, little puzzles. She rarely smiled, but she always waited for him. Suddenly, the sentence from Margaret made perfect sense. When this bench is ready, you'll always have somewhere to come home to. It had never been a romantic promise. It had been a promise to a frightened child who no longer believed the world was safe. Helen opened another storage drawer and carefully removed an old newspaper clipping. The headline described volunteers rebuilding Harbor Point after the hurricane. Thomas appeared in one corner of the photograph. Sarah and Emily stood only a few feet away. Across the bottom, someone had handwritten a short note. Bench delayed until Samuel arrives. I stared at the words in disbelief. I never came. Helen looked at me kindly. No. I stayed home because my father became ill. She nodded. Thomas understood. The weight I had carried for half a century shifted into something even heavier. If I had made that trip all those years ago, the promise might already have been fulfilled. Ethan quietly asked the question I no longer had the courage to speak. Do you know what happened to Sarah and Emily? Helen's expression changed. I do. Hope rose inside me for the first time. They moved away about a year later. The hope disappeared just as quickly. We've searched every public record we could think of, Ethan said. Helen hesitated. There's one complication. She reached into another folder and removed a folded envelope addressed to Thomas Whitaker. The postmark was dated almost 49 years earlier. It arrived months after everyone believed he'd left the coast. My hands trembled as I accepted it. It was returned unopened after your family had already moved. The envelope was still sealed. A second unopened letter. Another voice from the past, waiting to be heard. I looked toward the bench standing quietly outside the museum window. For the first time, it seemed possible that my greatest mistake had never been refusing to sell it. It had been waiting so long that I had stopped searching for the people it was meant to find. Now the workshop was only days away from closing forever, and another unanswered letter rested in my hands. Whatever was inside would decide whether my brother's promise could still be kept, or whether I'd already failed him beyond repair. I waited until Ethan and Helen stood beside me before breaking the brittle seal. For nearly half a century, the letter had traveled farther than any of us realized, surviving moves, forgotten filing cabinets, and the slow erosion of memory. Whatever Thomas had never been able to read was finally about to speak. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. Dear Thomas, Emily asks every week if the bench is finished. She still remembers the afternoon you promised there would always be a place where she could sit whenever life became too heavy. I think that promise has helped her more than you could ever imagine. We're leaving Harbor Point next month. My sister has offered us a fresh start in Maple Ridge after everything that's happened here. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I wanted you to know that your kindness gave my daughter something no storm could wash away. If the bench is ever completed, don't worry about finding us. We'll find it. Sarah. No forwarding address. No instructions. Only faith. I lowered the letter slowly. For years, I had believed I was responsible for locating Sarah and Emily. Thomas had believed something entirely different. They'll find it, Ethan whispered. I nodded, though the realization left me almost breathless. The bench wasn't meant to be delivered. It was meant to be visible. Suddenly, every decision I had made without understanding its purpose revealed its meaning. Keeping the bench near the workshop entrance. Refusing private collectors. Never placing it inside storage. Always positioning it where strangers walking through town could see it from the sidewalk. I hadn't been protecting an object. I had unknowingly been protecting an invitation. Helen looked toward the lighthouse through the museum windows. Thomas trusted people more than circumstances. He always did. She smiled sadly. Maybe that's why he never told anyone else. The discovery should have filled me with hope. Instead, it exposed a painful truth. My workshop stood only 5 days away from permanent closure. Once another owner took possession of the building, the bench would disappear into private hands unless I chose otherwise. The promise had survived 50 years, but it might still die because I had waited too long to understand it. On the drive home, neither Ethan nor I spoke very much. Late that evening, after returning the bench to its familiar place beside the workshop entrance, I sat on it for what I believed might be the last time. Across the street, neighbors continued their routines without noticing the quiet battle unfolding inside my heart. Selling the bench would provide enough money to make retirement comfortable, Donating it to a museum would preserve Thomas's craftsmanship. Keeping it inside my own home would satisfy sentiment. Every practical choice pointed away from the promise. Ethan finally broke the silence. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." "You do." I looked at him. "You've known since we read Sarah's letter." His words unsettled me because they were true. The next morning, I called the real estate agent handling the sale of my property. "I need one change in the agreement." She sounded surprised. "The buyers won't delay closing." "I'm not asking them to." "What kind of change?" "The bench stays exactly where it is." There was a long pause. "Mr. Whitaker," the buyers specifically mentioned wanting everything included. "They can have every tool, every cabinet, every table I've ever built, but not the bench." She sighed gently. "They'll almost certainly refuse." "If they do," I answered quietly, "I'll cancel the sale." When I hung up, Ethan stared at me in disbelief. "You'd walk away from your retirement over one bench?" I rested my hand against the smooth oak armrest, where the tiny lighthouse remained hidden beneath decades of careful polishing. "Not over a bench? Then over what?" I smiled sadly. "Over whether a frightened little girl's last reason to believe in tomorrow still deserves a chance to come home." By evening, the buyers had returned their answer. They would not change the contract. To them, the bench was simply the workshop's most valuable piece. To me, it had just become something far more costly. For the first time since deciding to retire, it appeared I might lose both the sale and the future I had carefully planned. And somewhere beyond everything I could see, I could not help wondering whether Emily had ever spent all these years still searching for the place Thomas promised she would someday find. The buyers arrived the following afternoon with their attorney and real estate agent. They walked through the workshop carefully, measuring walls, discussing renovations, and speaking about the building as though its future had already been decided. I did not blame them. From their perspective, it had. The only disagreement stood quietly beside the front door. The bench. Their spokesman, Daniel Mercer, stopped in front of it and ran his fingers across the polished oak. "This piece is exceptional," he said. "It's one of the reasons we agreed to your asking price. It isn't included. We've already discussed that." "I know." He folded the purchase contract and looked directly at me. "Mr. Whitaker, with respect, this isn't practical. No. You'd lose a considerable amount of money. Probably. And for what?" I rested my hand on the hidden lighthouse carved beneath the armrest. "For a promise." His expression suggested he believed I was speaking metaphorically. I wasn't. After nearly an hour of conversation, Daniel offered one final compromise. "We'll loan the bench to the museum in Harbor Point after restoration. It'll be preserved professionally, and everyone will admire your craftsmanship." For a brief moment, the proposal sounded almost reasonable. Then I remembered Sarah's words. "We'll find it." A museum was a destination people intentionally visited. Thomas had never promised Emily a destination. He had promised her a place to come home. I can't accept. Daniel slowly gathered the paperwork. "Then I suppose the sale is over." "So do I." He nodded politely before leaving. The workshop fell silent. Years of careful retirement planning disappeared with the sound of a closing door. Ethan remained standing beside me. "Are you all right?" "No." "Do you regret it?" I looked around the room that had shaped nearly my entire adult life. "I regret not understanding sooner." 3 days passed. Word spread through Maple Hollow that I had refused the largest offer anyone had ever made for the property because of an old wooden bench. Most people assumed grief had finally clouded my judgment. Several neighbors stopped by to persuade me to reconsider. A few quietly admitted they admired the decision even though they did not understand it. On the 4th morning, a silver pickup truck stopped across the street. A woman stepped out first, perhaps in her late 50s. Dark hair streaked with silver, thoughtful eyes that searched the workshop instead of the road. She stood perfectly still after noticing the bench. Then she whispered something I could not hear. A younger man helped an elderly woman from the passenger seat. The older woman leaned heavily on a cane. Her movements were slow. Her face carried the unmistakable traces of a difficult life. The moment she saw the bench, tears filled her eyes. Without saying a word, she walked toward it. Every instinct told me not to interrupt. She stopped beside the right armrest and slowly turned her hand underneath the polished oak. Her fingertips found the tiny lighthouse, exactly where Thomas had carved it. She closed her eyes. "Oh my goodness," the words escaped almost as a prayer. The younger man looked confused. "Grandma?" She smiled through tears. "I told you it was real." I stepped outside. The elderly woman looked at me for several long seconds before speaking. "You must be Samuel." The sound of my own name froze me where I stood. "I am." She nodded gently. "My mother used to describe your eyes." My breath caught. "Emily?" She smiled. "My full name is Emily Collins." For 50 years I had imagined this meeting countless different ways. None of them prepared me for its quiet simplicity. Ethan stood speechless behind me. Emily reached into her handbag and carefully removed a small wooden bird whose paint had long since worn away. "I've carried this since I was 6. I recognized it instantly. Thomas had carved it with his pocket knife while waiting for rain to stop outside Sarah's damaged house. "My mother made me promise never to throw it away," Emily said softly. "She always believed one day we'd find the bench." Before I could answer, Daniel Mercer's truck unexpectedly turned back into the parking lot. He stepped out holding the unsigned contract. "I've been thinking about this all weekend," he began. Then he noticed Emily resting her hand on the hidden lighthouse. He stopped speaking. Confusion replaced certainty. For the first time, someone outside our small circle was witnessing the promise become visible. No explanation could possibly carry the same weight as what stood silently before him. And in that moment, the outcome no longer depended on convincing anyone. It depended on whether people were willing to honor a promise they had finally seen with their own eyes. Daniel Mercer stood silently for several moments, looking from Emily to the bench and then back to me. The contract in his hand suddenly seemed far less important than the weathered wooden bird Emily still held so carefully. No one rushed to fill the silence. Some truths deserve room to settle before anyone speaks. Finally, Daniel folded the paperwork and slipped it back into his briefcase. "I've spent 30 years buying old buildings," he said quietly. "I thought I understood the value of craftsmanship." He glanced toward the bench. I was wrong. He walked over to me and extended his hand. The sale can wait. I shook it, uncertain what he meant. No, he continued. The building can wait. The promise comes first. He turned toward Emily. If this place has been waiting for you all these years, then nobody should be the reason it stops today. Emily wiped away another tear before sitting gently on the bench. For a long moment, she said nothing. She simply rested her fingers along the smooth oak armrest, exactly where the tiny lighthouse had been hidden for half a century. I used to dream about this bench, she whispered. When I was a little girl, my mother would tell me that somewhere there was a place where storms couldn't follow us forever. She smiled through her tears. I stopped believing it was real many years ago. I reached into my pocket and placed Thomas's letter beside Sarah's unopened message on the seat between us. He never stopped believing. Emily carefully unfolded the letters and read them in silence. When she finished, she pressed both pages against her heart. My mother passed away 6 years ago, she said softly. Before she died, she asked me never to stop looking whenever I happened to pass an old woodworking shop. She laughed gently through her tears. I thought she was asking me to hold on to a childhood story. I shook my head. She was asking you to hold on to hope. Ethan quietly carried the little wooden bird from Emily's hands and placed it beside the brass compass that had rested in my workshop for decades. Without planning it, the two objects finally belonged together. The compass that had waited for a journey to end, and the bird that had carried a frightened child's hope across half a century. Daniel cleared his throat. I'd still like to buy your workshop someday. I smiled. Someday. But not today. He looked around the room before adding, If you're willing, I'd rather restore this place than replace it. The suggestion surprised all of us. Instead of ending my workshop, perhaps its next chapter had simply arrived wearing a different face. Over the following weeks, the front entrance remained exactly as Thomas had imagined. The bench stayed where every passerby could see it. A small bronze plaque was placed beneath it, carrying only one sentence. Always leave room for someone to come home. No names, no dates, no explanation. It did not need one. Visitors often sat there without knowing its full history, yet many lingered longer than they intended. Conversations began. Families reunited. Strangers rested. Children laughed. The promise continued, doing exactly what Thomas believed it would do long before either of us understood why. As for Ethan, he never let the workshop close. Instead, he became its next craftsman, teaching every apprentice that the finest work a carpenter can build is not a table, a cabinet, or even a beautiful bench. It is a place where another person's hope is quietly protected until they are ready to find it. If this story reminded you that kindness can outlive the hands that first created it, I hope you'll carry that thought into someone else's life today. May your promises be worth keeping, your home always welcome those who need it most, and may quiet acts of honor continue finding their way back to the hearts that have been waiting for them.